Captain Dane Corven was dreaming of coffee when the universe decided to fold itself around his ship like an origami crane made of physics. One moment he was coasting through slipstream, that comfortable between space where stars blurred into watercolor streaks, and the next his instruments were screaming in 6 different languages of alarm. The reconnaissance vessel Sparrow lurched sideways through dimensions that shouldn't have existed, and Dane had exactly enough time to think, well, this is new, before his consciousness decided to take an unscheduled vacation. He woke to the taste of copper and the sensation that someone had replaced his skeleton with live electrical wiring. His eyes opened onto a ceiling that actually breathed, bioluminescent veins pulsing with light that shifted from deep violet to seafoam green, following rhythms that reminded him uncomfortably of a heartbeat. The bench beneath him was crystalline and warm, conforming to his body with the kind of consideration that high-end furniture catalogs promised but never delivered. "You're awake," said a voice like honey poured over steel. "Good. I was beginning to think human neurology was more fragile than the reports suggested." Dane turned his head, which protested the movement with a spike of pain behind his eyes, and saw her. Blue skin the color of deep ocean twilight, golden hair that seemed to generate its own light, falling past shoulders clad in something that looked like armor but moved like silk. Her face was striking in that way that made you forget what you were about to say. High cheekbones, full lips, eyes that held depths he suspected went well beyond the physical. But it was the ears that confirmed he wasn't hallucinating from oxygen deprivation. Long, elegantly tapered, sweeping back from her skull, and adorned with rings that hummed with barely audible power, each one inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "You know," Dane managed, his voice rough, "usually when I get abducted by aliens, they at least offer me a drink first." One perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose. Around her, a dozen guards in matching armor that seemed grown rather than forged stiffened, hands moving toward weapons that probably had settings ranging from stun to reduce to constituent atoms. She raised one hand in a gesture of such casual authority that they all froze mid-motion. "I am Empress Kaelith," she said, moving closer with steps that made no sound. "Sovereign of the endless reaches, unifier of 17 star systems, keeper of the stellar compact." She paused, studying him with the intensity of a collector examining a potentially rare specimen. "And you are Captain Dane Corven of the Terran Reconnaissance Fleet, currently 300 light-years from home and remarkably calm about it." "Oh, I'm screaming internally," Dane assured her. "I'm just very professional." He tested the restraints holding him to the bench, some kind of energy field that felt like warm honey but held like steel. "These are new, graviton-based. Quantum-entangled force architecture," she corrected, and there was something almost like pleasure in her voice at his recognition of advanced technology. "You have some education, then. Good. I despise conversations with primitives who think every mechanism beyond their understanding is magic." "We prefer charmingly retrotech," Dane said. "It's part of Earth's rustic appeal. Very farmhouse chic, but with spaceships." Her lips twitched. It might have been a smile trying to remember what it was supposed to look like. She gestured again, and the restraints vanished, leaving Dane free to sit up. Every nerve in his body suggested this was a terrible time to try standing, so he stayed put, taking inventory. His flight suit was intact. No obvious wounds. All his fingers and toes still sent back status reports when queried. "Tell me about your world," Kaelith said, settling onto a throne that hadn't been there a moment before. The room seemed to reshape itself around her, walls flowing like liquid mercury into a configuration that suggested this was her space, and everything else was just visiting. "Earth, I've read the survey data, but data lacks flavor." "Flavor," Dane repeated. "You pulled me out of slipstream with technology I don't understand, brought me aboard what I'm guessing is a flagship that could probably crack my homeworld like a walnut, and you want travel recommendations." I want to understand what makes 7 billion humans cling to one unremarkable planet when the galaxy offers so much more. She leaned forward, and her eyes, he could see now they were flecked with gold, like stars drowning in an ocean, fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. Your species broadcasts its chaos into space like a beacon. Wars, peace, art, destruction, all tumbling over each other in electromagnetic waves. You're messy, inefficient, and yet here I am, personal audience with an empress. Dane managed to stand, pleased when his legs only wobbled slightly. I'm guessing you don't do this for every lost pilot who wanders into your territory. Your ship was not lost, she said. It was invited. Your invitations need work on the phrasing. This time the smile was definite, brief as lightning but genuine. One of her guards made a sound like a shocked intake of breath. Kaelith's eyes flicked toward him and he went very still, the way small animals do when they realize they've attracted a predator's attention. She stood in one fluid motion, and Dane realized she was taller than him by several inches, though whether that was genetics or the gravity field subtly adjusting her height for dramatic effect, he couldn't tell. Come, she said. Before we discuss why you're here, let me show you something your primitive sensors could never detect. She walked toward a wall that dissolved into an archway, and Dane followed because the alternative was standing alone in a room full of armed guards who looked like they'd be delighted to demonstrate their weapons' various settings. The corridor beyond was wide enough to drive a truck through, walls flowing with that same breathing bioluminescence, and everywhere he looked he saw evidence of technology so advanced it looped back around to looking organic. Coffee, Kaelith said suddenly. You were thinking of coffee when we brought you in. I tasted the thought echo in the translation field. You can read minds. Dane tried to keep the alarm out of his voice and failed completely. Surface impressions only, and only during the initial scan. Your thoughts now are your own. She paused at what looked like a service alcove, where a machine that might have been grown rather than built waited. I've never encountered this coffee substance. The chemical analysis suggests it's a mild, psychoactive stimulant that your species has ritualized into a social institution. That's one way to describe the foundation of human civilization, Dane agreed. You've conquered 17 star systems and never tried coffee. I have conquered 17 star systems and absorbed 43 distinct civilizations, she corrected, her fingers dancing across controls that responded to her touch like eager pets. None of them poisoned themselves with burnt bean water for pleasure. The machine produced 2 cups of something that steamed promisingly. Kaelith took one, studied it with the caution of someone who'd learned that appearances could be very deceiving, and took a careful sip. Her face went through a remarkable journey of expressions: surprise, disgust, consideration, and finally something approaching understanding. It's terrible, she said. Yeah, but it's our terrible, Dane replied, taking his own cup and nearly weeping with gratitude. It wasn't good coffee by any measure, but it was hot and caffeinated and blessedly familiar. You get used to it. I have ended wars over better reasons than this beverage. But she took another sip, her long ears twitching slightly as she processed the taste. Though I begin to see why your species is so aggressively expansionist despite your technological limitations. You'd have to be consuming this regularly. They walked in silence for a moment, and Dane tried to process the surreality of sharing bad coffee with an alien empress who'd apparently yanked him across 300 light-years for reasons still unclear. Around them, the ship hummed with life. He could hear voices in the distance, the whisper of systems that probably managed more data in a second than Earth's entire internet, the subtle vibration of engines that bent spacetime like it owed them money. You called my ship charmingly primitive earlier, he said finally. Want to know what I think? I assume you'll tell me regardless. This flagship of yours, with its breathing walls and quantum restraints and coffee machines that probably cost more than my annual salary. He gestured broadly at their surroundings. It's compensation. Every guard within earshot froze. Kaelith stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Dane pressed on, because he'd apparently decided that surviving the day was optional. You've got 17 star systems, technology that makes ours look like we're banging rocks together, and the kind of power that probably has planets renaming themselves in your honor. But you pulled one unremarkable human out of Slipstream just to ask him about coffee and hear him sass you. That's not the behavior of someone who's satisfied with conquest. The silence stretched long enough that Dane started calculating how quickly he could dive behind the nearest corridor intersection. Then Kaelith laughed, a real laugh, not the polite sound of someone acknowledging humor but genuine amusement that echoed off the breathing walls. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said. "I'm really hoping for brave, but I'll settle for entertainingly stupid if it keeps me alive." "Come," she said again, her mood shifting like weather patterns on a gas giant. "Before I change my mind about showing you the truth of Empire, let me introduce you to its cost. There's a gallery I think you should see, one that will help you understand why you're here, Captain Corven, and what I'm about to offer you." She led him deeper into the ship, and Dane followed, coffee cup in hand, trying not to think about how far he was from home or how little sense any of this made. Behind them, the guards trailed like dangerous shadows, and ahead, something waited that an Empress wanted him to see badly enough to reach across the stars and pluck him from safety. Whatever it was, Dane suspected it would explain everything and solve nothing, which seemed to be the running theme of his day. The memorial wing stretched before them like a cathedral built by a civilization that had forgotten how to pray. Dane followed Kaelith through an archway that seemed to shimmer with barely contained grief, and found himself in a corridor so vast he couldn't see the far end. On either side, alcoves glowed with soft light, each one containing artifacts that hummed with the weight of extinct meaning. "This is where I keep the dead," Kaelith said, her voice different now, quieter, stripped of imperial certainty. "Not bodies. Bodies are easy. These are the things that mattered to people who no longer exist to care about them." She stopped at the first alcove, where a crystalline harp floated in a suspension field, its strings vibrating to rhythms Dane couldn't hear. "The Velian Commonwealth. They surrendered after I destroyed their defensive grid. Very practical, very sensible. They integrated into the Empire within a standard year." Her fingers traced patterns in the air near the harp, not quite touching. "This instrument was played at the signing of their surrender. It's tuned to their planet's atmospheric resonance. Every song it plays is technically a recording of their sky breathing." "That's beautiful and horrifying in equal measure," Dane said. "Do you play it?" "I don't know how. The last person who did died 40 years ago and they didn't teach anyone else." Kaelith moved to the next alcove, where armor stood in permanent vigil, plates of something that looked like frozen starlight, scorched and dented. "King Thuron of the Cascade Reach. He challenged me to single combat rather than let his people die in a siege. I accepted. He lasted 17 minutes, which is 16 minutes longer than anyone expected." Dane studied the armor, noticing how the damage patterns suggested someone had fought with desperate skill against overwhelming power. "Did you respect him?" "I killed him," she said flatly. "Respect is what you give equals. He was an obstacle between my empire and stability." But her hand rested briefly on the armor's shoulder plate, the gesture almost tender. "He told jokes during the fight. Even when he was dying, he made puns about my technique. Said I fought like someone who'd read about combat but never enjoyed it." Was he right? Annoyingly, yes. She continued walking and Dane hurried to keep pace. The Stellar Compact requires member civilizations to maintain peace, trade freely, and accept centralized governance. In exchange, they receive protection, technology, and access to resources they could never obtain alone. It's a good deal. Most worlds accept after minimal resistance. And the ones that don't. Kaelith stopped at an alcove containing star charts that rotated slowly, trade routes marked in light that pulsed like dying stars. The merchant collective refused integration. They preferred their independence and thought their economic leverage would protect them. She gestured, and the holographic display expanded, showing a web of connections spanning dozens of worlds. I froze their assets, blockaded their hub stations, and waited. Within 3 months, their economy collapsed. They surrendered without a shot fired. Efficient, Dane said, because he couldn't think of anything else that wouldn't sound like judgment. War is inefficient. People die, infrastructure burns, knowledge is lost. She touched the display, and it shifted to show populations, billions of lives reduced to statistical flows. I prefer to make resistance so obviously futile that no one tries. The first few conquests were bloody. The next dozen weren't. That's called learning. They moved deeper into the gallery, passing alcoves that held musical instruments, religious texts, weapons that had failed their wielders, and artwork from species whose names Dane couldn't pronounce. Each one came with a story Kaelith told with the detached precision of someone reciting facts while trying not to feel them. "You know what I notice?" Dane said, stopping at an alcove where a child's toy, something like a stuffed animal but with too many limbs, sat in its preservation field. "You remember everything. Every fight, every surrender, every stupid joke a dying king made. That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't care. Remembering isn't caring, it's archival duty." But her ears twitched, a tell he was learning meant discomfort. Someone should remember, otherwise what was the point? The point of what? Conquering them or preserving their stuff? Both, neither. She pressed her palm against the field containing the toy, and for a moment her expression cracked open into something raw. This belonged to a child on Veritex Prime. The planetary governor refused surrender, forced me to orbital bombardment. 40 million dead in an afternoon. I found this in the rubble when I went down to survey the damage. Dane felt his throat tighten. Why keep it? Because someone should remember that 40 million people had lives and loves and children with toys. She pulled her hand back, the imperial mask sliding into place. And because the next governor who thinks about refusing surrender comes here first and sees what resistance costs. "That's some twisted therapy you've got going," Dane said. "Do you come here often, or is this just for special occasions like kidnapping random pilots?" She almost smiled. "You use humor like armor. It's transparent but effective." "I learned it from King Thuron, apparently. Speaking of which," he gestured around the gallery, "if you're trying to convince me you're a monster, you're doing a terrible job. Monsters don't build museums to their victims." "Perhaps I'm a monster who wants to be remembered accurately." She led him to a section where the alcoves held not artifacts but holographic recreations of battles, cities burning in slow motion, the precise moment fleets surrendered frozen like insects in amber. Every civilization I've absorbed tried to fight first, negotiate second. Some were brave, some were stupid, most were both, but they all made the same mistake. Which was, they thought they were special, that their homeworld, their culture, their way of life was worth dying for. She waved her hand through a hologram showing a planet fragmenting under weapons fire, the image dispersing and reforming like a recurring nightmare. They were wrong. Nothing is worth dying for when the alternative is living and adapting. That's the first truth of empire. What's the second truth? That the Empress who teaches it doesn't believe it anymore. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession she hadn't meant to make. Dane watched her face, seeing the cracks in the imperial facade widen slightly before she reinforced them with visible effort. "The cafeteria on your flagship," he said, deliberately breaking the moment. "I heard it serves something called nutrient paste 7 ways. Is that 7 ways to prepare paste, or 7 different types of paste? Because either way it sounds like a war crime." Kaelith blinked, thrown by the conversational pivot. "The cafeteria serves cuisine from all member civilizations. The nutrient paste is from the Gelsian hives. They're methane breathers who find it delicious. And the other 6 ways. Variations in molecular density and flavor profiles that I'm told are quite distinct, if you have the proper sensory organs. So you're saying the food is terrible, unless you're a methane-breathing hive mind. I'm saying empire is complicated, and sometimes involves compromises in catering. Dane laughed, surprised to find genuine amusement cutting through the weight of surrounded extinction. You know, for a terrifying galactic empress, you're remarkably concerned about cafeteria reviews. Morale matters. Armies march on their stomachs, even in space. She was walking again, leading him toward something at the corridor's end, a structure larger than the others, a temple relocated stone by stone, its architecture suggesting prayers directed at stars that had probably burned out millennia ago. But you're right. I do care about strange things for someone who's supposed to be beyond such concerns. They entered the temple, and Dane felt the temperature drop, not physically but spiritually, as if the stones themselves remembered being sacred. The walls were covered in writing he couldn't read, prayers to gods who'd failed to save anyone. The ascendant faith of Krell, Kaelith said, her voice echoing in the vaulted space. They believed their deities would protect them from conquest. They were wrong, but they believed beautifully. She sat on what had once been an altar, the gesture casual and somehow blasphemous. I brought this entire structure aboard rather than leave it to orbital decay. My archaeologists think I'm sentimental. My generals think I'm weak. What do you think, Captain? Dane looked around the temple, at the prayers carved by hands that had trusted in divine intervention, at the Empress who'd conquered their world and then preserved their holiest place. I think you're asking questions you're afraid to answer. And what questions are those? Whether someone can do necessary evil for so long they forget what good even looks like. Whether power and loneliness are the same thing. Whether you brought me here to show me your trophies, or to see if I'd look at them and see something you can't anymore. Kaelith stood, her height and presence suddenly overwhelming in the confined space, and Dane wondered if he'd finally pushed too far. Her eyes, gold-flecked and ancient, fixed on him with an intensity that felt like gravity. You're perceptive, she said quietly. Most people see the Empress. You see the woman pretending she had no choice. Did you have a choice? Everyone has choices. Some of us just get better at justifying the ones we make. She moved toward the temple's exit, pausing at the threshold. Come, I have one more thing to show you before we discuss why you're really here. Something that isn't dead yet, but probably should be. The throne room appeared when they stepped through a doorway that hadn't existed moments before, space folding in ways that made Dane's inner ear protest violently. He stumbled, caught himself, and looked up at a chamber so vast it seemed to contain its own weather system. The walls were obsidian, polished to mirror perfection, and beyond the transparent ceiling stars wheeled past in configurations that suggested they were moving at speeds his brain refused to process. Kaelith's throne sat at the room's center, elevated on a dais that generated its own gravitational field. She climbed the steps with practiced ease while Dane waited below, trying not to feel like he was about to receive sentencing for crimes he hadn't committed yet. I'm going to offer you something, Kaelith said, settling into her throne with the casual authority of someone who'd been born to it, or conquered enough worlds that it amounted to the same thing. And I need you to listen to the entire proposal before you start making jokes, because if you interrupt with another cafeteria comment, I may have to have you thrown out an airlock. Would that be a metaphorical airlock or? Captain Corven. Right, listening. I'm very good at listening. Dane mimed zipping his lips, which earned him a look that could have curdled milk at 50 paces. Kaelith leaned forward, her golden hair catching light that seemed to emanate from the throne itself. I am offering you governorship of half my empire. 8.5 star systems, including Sol. Earth would not be conquered. Earth would be elevated. A seat of power, a jewel in the stellar compact's crown, with you as its voice and protector. Dane's brain made several attempts to process this information, and failed each time. I'm sorry, did you just offer me 8.5 star systems? What's the half? Do I get to pick which planets, or is it more of a mystery box situation? The half is a border region still being integrated. 3 habitable worlds, 2 resource-rich asteroid belts, and a hyperspace nexus that would give Earth access to trade routes spanning thousands of light years. She gestured, and holographic displays erupted around the room, showing star systems in exquisite detail. Your species would have medical technology that could extend lifespans by centuries, agricultural systems that could turn any planet into a garden, defensive capabilities that would make you untouchable by any hostile force in the galaxy. And all I have to do is... Dane trailed off, waiting for the other shoe to drop from orbit. Leave Earth, rule from my side, become the human face of the Empire's continued expansion. She stood, descending the dais with slow, deliberate steps. You would have authority over billions, command fleets that make your entire planetary defense grid look like children with fireworks. Access to knowledge that would revolutionize every field of science your species has barely begun to explore. But I'd have to leave Earth, Dane repeated. Yes, and help you conquer more civilizations. Integrate, she corrected. The compact doesn't conquer. It offers membership with enthusiasm. Is that what we're calling it now? Membership with enthusiasm. He watched the holographic displays rotate, showing worlds he'd never heard of, technologies that would make his homeworld's brightest minds weep with envy. This is insane. You realize this is insane. You could pick anyone. You've got 17 star systems full of people who'd kill for this opportunity. I don't want someone who would kill for it. Kaelith stopped 3 steps above him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes were actually tiny, moving lights, like stars in miniature. Do you know what happens when you conquer 17 star systems? People see you as either a goddess or a monster. My advisors fear me. My generals obey me. My citizens worship me from a distance comfortable enough that they don't have to acknowledge I'm a person. And you think I see you as a person? You've spent the last few hours treating me like a slightly eccentric colleague with concerning hobbies. You've made jokes about my cafeteria, called my flagship compensation, and suggested I'm asking questions I'm afraid to answer. She smiled, and it was genuine but edged with something desperately lonely. You're the first being in decades to look at me with neither worship nor hatred, just weary human skepticism and a concerning addiction to bad coffee. Dane sat down on the dais steps because his legs had opinions about continuing to stand. So this is what? Loneliness wrapped in a job offer. This is practicality. She sat beside him, the gesture so casual that somewhere in the flagship her guards were probably having collective heart attacks. Earth will be conquered eventually. If not by me, then by the next empire that rises or the one after that. Your species is loud, chaotic, and sitting on a planet perfect for colonization. You're a target whether you want to be or not. And your offer saves us from that. My offer gives you power instead of slavery, a voice instead of silence, the chance to guide how integration happens rather than have it forced upon you. She looked at the holographic displays, stars and planets spinning in their eternal dance. I've absorbed 43 civilizations. Some fought and were crushed. Some surrendered and were absorbed into irrelevance. A handful joined willingly and now sit at the heart of the compact, their cultures preserved and elevated. I'm offering Earth that third option. In exchange for me. In exchange for someone who will stand beside me and say when I'm wrong. Who will argue with me about the ethics of expansion while sharing terrible coffee. Who will look at everything I've built and still have the audacity to question whether it was worth building. She turned to face him fully, and the vulnerability in her expression was so raw it hurt to witness. I am surrounded by billions and I am utterly alone. Every conversation is theater. Every relationship is politics. I can't remember the last time someone spoke to me like I was just another person who happened to have an unfortunate amount of power. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard someone say while offering me half a galaxy. Is that a no? That's a I need to think about it while my brain reboots from complete overload. Dane rubbed his face, trying to organize thoughts that kept escaping like frightened cats. You're asking me to abandon my entire species, my home, everything I've ever known, to become your imperial sidekick. Co-ruler, she corrected. You'd have genuine authority, not ceremonial position. Co-ruler of an empire built on conquered worlds, and the kind of loneliness that makes you kidnap strangers for therapy sessions. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the blue skin and golden hair and imperial trappings to the exhaustion underneath. What happens if I say no? Then you return to your ship, which will be released from the gravitational net with a mild apology and a suggestion you forget this conversation happened. And Earth. The silence stretched long enough that Dane knew the answer before she spoke. Earth becomes another acquisition. Clean, efficient, with minimal bloodshed if your leaders are sensible. You'd be surprised how many civilizations surrender once they see what opposing the compact actually entails. She stood, brushing invisible dust from her armor-silk hybrid. But that's not the outcome I want. I didn't pull you across 300 light-years to threaten you. I did it because I'm tired, Captain Corven. Tired of being a monument. Tired of making the necessary choices alone. Tired of winning everything and having no one to share it with. You know, Dane said, standing to face her, my pension plan back on Earth is probably better. Full dental, reasonable retirement age, and I don't have to worry about the moral weight of galactic conquest keeping me up at night. She laughed, the sound echoing off obsidian walls and out into space where stars couldn't hear it. You're deflecting. I'm processing. There's a difference. He walked to the transparent ceiling, looking up at stars that were probably hundreds of light years away but looked close enough to touch. How long do I have to think about it? As long as you need. The Armada can wait. Can it? Because from where I'm standing, you seem like someone who's very good at making decisions quickly and living with the consequences slowly. You're not wrong. She joined him under the stars, and together they stood in silence, two people having an impossible conversation at the edge of everything. I'll have quarters prepared for you, full access to the flagship. Talk to my citizens, my advisors, my generals. See what empire really looks like when you're standing inside it instead of fleeing from its shadow. And if I still say no after all that, then I'll be disappointed, but I'll honor your choice. She met his eyes, and he saw truth there, painful and absolute. I may be many things, Captain, but I keep my word, even when it costs me. Even if it costs you Earth. Even then. She started walking toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Though I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that. I've grown rather fond of terrible coffee and the species that thinks it's drinkable. Dane watched her leave, the throne room suddenly enormous and empty, full of stars and silence, and an offer that could save his world or condemn it. He looked at the holographic displays still rotating around him, 8.5-star systems waiting for an answer he didn't know how to give. Well, he said to the empty room, this is definitely going in my memoirs under career decisions that seemed like good ideas at the time. The stars, predictably, offered no advice. They just kept spinning, indifferent to the choices of small beings with impossible dilemmas and rapidly cooling coffee. The quarters Kaelith assigned him had windows that looked out on 3 different star systems simultaneously, which Dane's brain insisted was impossible until he stopped trying to make sense of it and just accepted that Imperial flagships apparently didn't care about Euclidean geometry. He'd spent the night attempting sleep in a bed that adjusted to his body temperature and failed dreams, waking to find a message waiting. The flagship is yours to explore. Try the market district on deck 47. The food is better than nutrient paste, I promise. Dane found the market 2 hours later, after getting lost in corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking and asking directions from a security officer who'd looked at him like he'd grown a second head before providing an escort. The market sprawled across 3 interconnected decks, a controlled chaos of species he'd never seen selling things he couldn't identify, while the air filled with smells that ranged from appetizing to deeply concerning. He bought something that looked like fruit from a vendor with too many arms, and found a bench near a fountain that generated water from atmospheric humidity. The fruit tasted like strawberries mixed with copper, which was either exotic or poisonous. He was contemplating this when someone sat down beside him. "You're the human," said a man whose skin was covered in geometric patterns that shifted colors as he spoke. "The one the Empress brought aboard. Word travels fast on a flagship." "Apparently I'm famous," Dane said. "Should I be signing autographs or running for my life?" "Depends on who you ask." The man extended a hand that had 6 fingers. "Commander Vex, former rebellion leader on Tarsus 7, current logistics officer for the 3rd Fleet. I coordinate supply chains and occasionally wonder how I ended up here." Dane shook the offered hand, trying not to stare at the extra finger. "That's quite a career transition. Rebel to logistics officer seems like it skipped a few steps." "It skipped the step where I died in a hopeless last stand," Vex said cheerfully. "The Empress gave me a choice after we surrendered. Accept integration and use my organizational skills productively, or refuse and watch my people suffer occupation while I rotted in detention. Turns out I'm very practical when presented with those options. Do you regret it?" Vex's patterns flickered from blue to something close to purple. "Every day. And also not at all. Resistance is remembering while surviving, my friend. I remember Tarsus 7 before the compact. I remember fighting ships that could crack our cities from orbit. And I remember that the Empress could have wiped us out but chose negotiation first, bombardment as a last resort." He pulled out something that looked like a flask and took a drink. "She's not kind, but she's not needlessly cruel either. That's rarer than you'd think in conquerors." "Damning with faint praise," Dane observed. "It's the best you get in Empire." Vex offered him the flask. "Tarsian whiskey, 90 proof and made from grain we're only allowed to grow because she preserved our agricultural traditions." Dane took a cautious sip and felt his sinuses ignite. "That's incredible and possibly corrosive to human biology. If you survive it, you've passed the initiation." Vex reclaimed his flask, grinning. "So what did she offer you?" "Must have been spectacular to justify kidnapping across 300 light years. Half the Empire and a really awkward working relationship." The flask stopped halfway to Vex's lips. "She what?" 8.5 star systems, governorship, full authority, and all I have to do is abandon my homeworld and become her co-ruler while she continues expanding the compact." Dane bit into his maybe fruit, which had started tasting better, or his taste buds had given up protesting. "It's a terrible offer that would save my planet and cost me everything that makes me who I am." "Gods and stars," Vex breathed. "She's actually doing it." "Doing what?" "Looking for someone to share the weight." Vex's patterns settled into a steady amber. "There are rumors. The Empress doesn't have friends, doesn't have confidants, doesn't have anyone who treats her like a person instead of an institution. My predecessor in logistics said she once overheard Kaelith talking to herself in the memorial wing, having arguments with dead kings about whether conquest was worth the cost." He leaned back, studying Dane with open curiosity. "You must have impressed her or confused her, possibly both." "I made jokes about her cafeteria and suggested her flagship was compensation for psychological issues." "Then definitely both." Vex stood, pocketing his flask. "Word of advice from someone who chose survival over martyrdom. There are worse fates than serving an empire that at least pretends to care about its citizens. But there are also better fates than forgetting who you were before you started making compromises. Choose carefully, human. The Empress doesn't make offers like this lightly." He walked away into the market crowd, leaving Dane alone with his thoughts and his possibly toxic fruit. The fountain burbled cheerfully, generating water from nothing, a small reminder that everything here operated on principles Earth was centuries from understanding. The next 3 days became a strange education in imperial life. Dane wandered the flagship like a ghost with clearance, observing and being observed. He watched Kaelith conduct a treaty negotiation with representatives from a system requesting compact membership, her demeanor shifting from warm welcome to cold calculation in seconds as she outlined terms that were generous but absolute. He sat in on a strategy session where generals argued about fleet deployments using holographic displays that showed force projections across light years. And Kaelith settled their disputes with decisions that seemed instant, but were clearly built on decades of experience. He found her in the observation deck one evening, staring at stars while data streams floated around her like luminescent curtains. She was eating something from a bowl, and it took him a moment to recognize the smell. "Is that popcorn?" he asked. "Your species has one genuinely worthwhile contribution to galactic cuisine." She didn't turn around, just kept watching stars drift past. "I had my food synthesizers analyze the chemical composition and replicate it. It took 17 attempts to get the butter ratio correct." Dane sat beside her, and she offered the bowl without comment. The popcorn was perfect, which was somehow more unsettling than anything else about the past few days. "I met Commander Vex," he said between handfuls. "Former rebel, current logistics officer, philosophical drunk. Vex is good at his job. That's all that matters in the compact. He said resistance is remembering while surviving. He would know. He organized the Tarsian resistance for 3 years before I broke their supply lines and forced surrender." She finally looked at him, and in the starlight her face seemed younger, more uncertain. "He hates me, but he serves efficiently and his people are fed and safe. That's the bargain Empire offers. Doesn't it bother you, being hated by people you defeated?" "It would bother me more if they loved me for conquering them. At least hatred is honest." She set down the popcorn, gesturing at the viewscreen where a planet rotated slowly, cities glowing like bioluminescent organisms in deep ocean. "That's Veritex Prime, rebuilt after the bombardment, population restored. They have festivals now celebrating their integration into the compact. Their children learn that their world was saved by joining us, not that it was nearly destroyed for resisting." "That's propaganda," Dane said quietly. "That's survival. If they remembered the truth without context, they'd spend generations planning revenge for something that can't be undone. Better they remember victory than defeat, belonging than occupation." She pulled up another image, Earth, blue and perfect and impossibly far away. "If your world joins, this is what I offer, not erasure but transformation. Your history preserved, your culture elevated, your people given futures they couldn't imagine alone. In exchange for sovereignty. Sovereignty is what nations tell themselves they have until someone stronger proves otherwise. I'm offering you protection from that truth and power within it." They sat in silence, eating popcorn and watching stars wheel past, and Dane thought about Vex's words, about remembering while surviving, about the terrible compromises that kept billions alive. "The Armada," he said finally. "How close are we to Sol's system?" "Close enough that you could see your son if I adjusted the viewscreen. Far enough that there's still time for your answer." "And if I say no?" Her hand tightened around the popcorn bowl just slightly. "Then I'll hate myself for what comes next, but I'll do it anyway because that's what Empire requires. Consistency. If I show mercy to Earth, every system sees weakness, and weakness means war." She set the bowl down with careful precision. "But I'm hoping you won't make me choose between you and stability." "That's not fair," Dane said. "Nothing about this is fair. Fair would be leaving Earth alone. Fair would be letting civilizations develop naturally. Fair would be a universe where strength didn't matter more than beauty or truth or any of the things people claim to value when they're safe enough to afford philosophy." She stood, and starlight painted her in shades of blue and gold and infinite weariness. "I'm not offering you fair, Captain. I'm offering you what's possible. That's all I've ever had to give." The balcony shouldn't have existed. Dane understood enough physics to know that standing in vacuum without a suit was generally fatal, But Kaelith's private observation platform somehow created a pocket of atmosphere held in place by shields so advanced they were functionally invisible. Below them, 17 star systems glowed in a three-dimensional holographic map, each light representing billions of lives under her rule. Behind them, Sol's system waited at the edge of sensor range, Earth a blue dot that contained everything he'd ever loved. "Last night," Kaelith said, her voice carrying easily in the impossible air. "Tomorrow the Armada advances, and I need your answer. Join me and Earth becomes a jewel in the compact. Refuse me and Earth becomes another conquest, because I can't show mercy without showing weakness, and weakness unravels everything I've built." Dane leaned against the railing, looking down at 17 systems worth of conquered peace. "You know what I've been thinking about? King Thuron, the one who made jokes while you killed him. You said he accused you of fighting like someone who'd read about combat but never enjoyed it. I don't see the relevance. You do the same thing with power. You've read all the books about empire, studied every historical conquest, learned every lesson about stability and control. But you've never enjoyed it, have you? Not once in however many years you've been doing this." Her ears twitched, that tell of discomfort he'd learned to recognize. Enjoyment is irrelevant. Effectiveness is what matters. Except it's eating you alive from the inside, and you're so lonely you kidnapped a random pilot just to have one honest conversation. He turned to face her fully. "That's why you offered me half your empire. Not because you need help ruling. You've got advisors and generals and entire bureaucracies for that. You need someone who will tell you the truth even when it hurts. And what truth would that be? That you're terrified the answer I give tonight means you're either a monster or a failure, and you can't figure out which outcome scares you more." Dane pulled out a flask he'd gotten from Vex, took a drink of Tarsian whiskey that no longer burned quite so badly, and offered it to her. "Want some? It pairs well with existential crises." She took the flask, studied it like it might contain answers, and drank. Her face went through those same expressions of surprise and reconsideration, and despite everything, Dane found himself smiling. "This is awful," she said. "Yeah, but it's honest awful. No pretense, no imperial presentation, just terrible alcohol that does what it promises." He reclaimed the flask. "You know what I realized while wandering your flagship and talking to people like Vex? The compact isn't evil. It's not even particularly cruel by historical empire standards. You've built something that actually functions, that keeps billions fed and mostly safe. That's not nothing. But it's also not home. You're offering me power, longevity, knowledge, influence, and adventure on a scale I can't even properly imagine. And none of it matters because it's not the smell of rain on Earth's pavement, or coffee made badly in my apartment, or knowing every star I see in the sky without needing a holographic map to explain them." He set the flask down on the railing. "You asked what makes 7 billion humans cling to one unremarkable planet when the galaxy offers so much more. The answer is that home isn't about what a place offers. It's about what it means." Kaelith moved to the map, her fingers tracing through holographic lights. "I had a home once. Small planet, provincial culture, dreams that didn't extend past the next valley. Then I learned there were other worlds, other possibilities, other ways to be. I left and never looked back. Do you regret it? Every single day. And not at all." She turned, and in the light of 17 conquered systems her face was ancient and young simultaneously. "I've given billions more than they dreamed possible. I've ended wars, cured diseases, elevated civilizations beyond their limitations. But I can't remember what my mother's voice sounded like, or the name of the boy I loved before I learned to love power, or what fruit tasted like when scarcity made it precious." "That's the saddest thing you've said, and you've had some strong competition this week. You're deflecting again. I'm preparing to disappoint you." Dane took a breath, looking at Earth's distant point of light. "The answer is no. Not because your offer isn't incredible, not because I don't understand what you're trying to build, and definitely not because I think you're a monster. The answer is no, because if I say yes, I become something else. Someone who chose power over belonging, advancement over memory, the promise of everything over the reality of home. The silence stretched so long that Dane wondered if he'd broken something fundamental. Kaelith stood perfectly still, staring at her empire like it might offer guidance, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm going to withdraw the armada." "What? You heard me. I'm ordering the fleets to pull back from Sol's system." She laughed, and it sounded like something breaking and healing simultaneously. "Not out of mercy, not out of kindness, but because you've shown me something I'd forgotten existed." "What's that?" "The possibility that strength isn't always about taking. Sometimes it's about walking away." She pulled up a holographic interface, her fingers dancing across controls that would send orders to fleets capable of cracking planets. "Earth isn't joining the compact. Not today, not with threats, not with you as leverage. Let your species develop naturally. Maybe in a few centuries they'll knock on the door themselves, and maybe they won't. Either way, it'll be their choice." Dane felt something unclench in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. "You're serious." "I'm always serious. It's my defining characteristic and personal curse." She finished whatever commands she was entering, and somewhere in the flagship systems were probably routing orders that would reshape the future. "I'm also sending you home with a gift, coordinates to a dead civilization's archive. Technology your people can reverse engineer, knowledge they can adapt. It won't make Earth invincible, but it'll give you a fighting chance if someone less philosophical comes calling." "Why?" "Because you looked at everything I offered and chose differently. Because King Thuron was right, and I've been fighting without joy for so long I forgot there were other ways to be strong. Because," she stopped, her ears twitching with what might have been amusement or might have been grief. "Because I'm tired, Captain Corven, tired of winning everything and having no one to share it with. And you've reminded me that maybe the problem isn't that I'm alone. Maybe it's that I've been looking for connection in all the wrong places. Like kidnapping random pilots. Like kidnapping random pilots and offering them half an empire when what I actually wanted was someone to share terrible coffee with, and tell me when I'm being ridiculous." They stood together on the impossible balcony, looking at space too vast to comprehend, and a future that had just shifted in ways neither could predict. Dane thought about going home, about explaining to his superiors that he'd been abducted by an empress who'd offered him 8.5-star systems, and he'd turned her down for reasons that probably wouldn't fit on a standard mission report. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're building something that matters. It's not perfect, it's not kind, but it's trying to be better than the alternative. That's more than most empires manage." "For what it's worth," she replied, "I think Earth is lucky to have people who love it enough to refuse galaxies. That's rarer than you'd think." She walked him back through the flagship's impossible corridors, past the memorial wing where dead civilizations kept their vigil, past the throne room where stars wheeled in judgment, all the way to the docking bay where the Sparrow waited, small and primitive and utterly beautiful. At the airlock she paused. "If you ever change your mind," she said, "the offer stands. 8.5 systems, terrible cafeteria food, and an empress who's learning to ask instead of command." "If I ever change my mind," Dane replied, "I'll bring better coffee and lower expectations. That's all anyone can ask." She touched his shoulder briefly, the gesture awkward but genuine. "Go home, Captain. Tell your people they have time to prepare, to grow, to decide their own future. And tell them that out here, past the edge of everything they know, someone is watching and rooting for them to surprise the universe." Dane boarded his ship, and the Sparrow's familiar controls felt like coming home after a dream that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. As he pulled away from the flagship, he watched it grow smaller in his view screen, a monument to power and loneliness that was choosing, for once, to let something go. The journey back to Earth took 3 days through Slipstream. and Dane spent them composing a report that would either make him famous or get him psychiatric evaluation. When Sol's system appeared on sensors, when Earth grew from a point to a planet, he felt something settle that the entire galaxy's worth of wonders couldn't have matched. Somewhere behind him, an empress stood on an impossible balcony, looking at 17 systems that were hers, and thinking about the one that got away, not the planet, but the possibility that there were still people in the universe who could look at everything she possessed and find it lacking. And somehow, improbably, that made both of them stronger than they'd been before.